Grace Matthews had always been a woman who lived life on her own terms. For years, she had been chasing success in the city, putting in long hours at a fast-paced marketing job. The busy streets, crowded with people and constant noise, felt like the world she belonged to. But after a painful breakup with someone she had loved deeply, Grace found herself at a crossroads. She wasn't sure where to go or what to do next. She needed a break, something that would help her heal and find herself again. One evening, scrolling through her social media, Grace saw a post about a tiny, peaceful town nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The post talked about the clean air, the quiet trails, and the sense of serenity that could only be found in nature. The more Grace read, the more she felt a pull towards the idea of escaping to this remote place. She had always loved nature, but had never been able to experience it fully while living in the city. Maybe this was exactly what she needed. Without thinking twice, Grace booked a cabin for 2 weeks in the small mountain town and began packing her things. She was excited, nervous, and curious all at once. It was the change she had been looking for, away from the chaos of the city and the painful memories of her past. When Grace arrived in the town, it was nothing like she had imagined. The air was fresh and crisp, and the smell of pine trees filled her lungs. The town was quiet, with only a handful of houses scattered across the hills. The streets were narrow, and everything seemed to move slowly. It felt like a world completely different from the one she had left behind. Her cabin was small but cozy, tucked away at the edge of the woods. She spent the first few days simply getting used to the silence and the slower pace of life. She took long walks through the woods, breathing in the fresh mountain air and watching the leaves change colors. For the first time in a long time, Grace felt at peace. But it wasn't just the quiet that was different here, it was the people. Most of the locals were friendly but reserved. They had lived in the mountains their entire lives, and they had little interest in the hustle and bustle of the world beyond their borders. Grace found it refreshing at first, but also a little isolating. She had come here to heal, but she also missed the connection she had in the city. One afternoon, while walking along a trail just outside of town, Grace encountered a man who would change her life in ways she couldn't yet understand. He was sitting on a large rock by the trail, his back turned to her as he gazed out at the view of the mountains. He was tall, with a rough, weathered face and a beard that looked like it had been there for years. He wore a flannel shirt, faded jeans, and heavy boots that had clearly seen their share of the rugged terrain at first. Grace wasn't sure if she should approach him. He looked like someone who valued his solitude, but something about his presence made her feel curious. She walked a little closer, trying not to make too much noise. "Hi," she said, trying to sound friendly but not intrusive. "It's such a beautiful view, isn't it?" The man turned his head slowly to look at her. His eyes were dark and serious, and there was a moment of silence between them before he spoke. "It is," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. "Ain't many people out here who appreciate it, though." Grace smiled awkwardly. "I'm just visiting. I've been here for a few days now, trying to get away from everything." The man nodded, his gaze returning to the view in front of him. "This place has a way of doing that. Makes you forget the noise. The world don't seem so loud up here." Grace felt a little embarrassed, unsure of how to keep the conversation going. But she also felt a strange sense of connection with this man, as if they were both strangers in a strange place, trying to make sense of it all. "I'm Grace," she said, offering her hand. He looked at her hand for a second, then stood up from the rock, towering over her. "Daryl," he said, shaking her hand with a firm grip. "I live around here. Know the woods better than I know the back of my hand." Grace smiled, feeling a little more at ease. "That's impressive. I'm still getting used to all the trails and paths around here." Daryl gave a small grunt of approval. "You'll get used to it. Just have to listen to the land, that's all." They talked for a little while longer, with Daryl sharing stories about the mountains and his life in the area. Grace learned that he had lived in the town for most of his life, working odd jobs and mostly keeping to himself. He was known in the town as a bit of a recluse, a man of few words who preferred the company of nature to people. His nickname, Bigfoot, had been given to him because of his size and the fact that he was often seen hiking through the woods, disappearing into the wilderness for days at a time for some reason. Grace found herself intrigued by Daryl. He wasn't like anyone she had ever met. He was rough around the edges, but there was something deep in his eyes that made her feel like he understood things she didn't even know how to put into words. After their first meeting, Grace kept running into him around town, always by chance. They would exchange brief pleasantries, but there was an unspoken understanding between them that neither of them could explain. One day, a few days later, Grace decided to ask Daryl if he would show her around the area. She had been wanting to explore more of the mountains, but she wasn't sure where to start. "Would you mind showing me around a bit?" she asked him, standing in front of his small cabin, which was tucked in the woods. "I'd love to see more of the trails, maybe even learn a thing or two about the area." Daryl looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. He was silent for so long that Grace wondered if he was going to refuse. Finally, he nodded. "All right, I'll show you around tomorrow morning. Be ready early." Grace was both surprised and excited by his response. The next morning, she met him at the edge of town as promised, and the two of them set off into the woods. Daryl led the way, his heavy boots crunching on the fallen leaves, while Grace struggled to keep up with his pace. He didn't talk much, but Grace didn't mind. She found that just being out there, surrounded by the peaceful quiet of the mountains, was enough. As the days went by, they spent more and more time together. Daryl would show her the best spots for hiking, teach her how to identify different plants and animals, and share stories about the land that only someone who had lived there his whole life would know. Grace found herself looking forward to these outings more than anything else. There was something about being with Daryl and the silence of the mountains that made her feel both calm and alive at the same time. But as much as she enjoyed their time together, Grace also began to feel something she hadn't expected: an attraction to Daryl. He wasn't handsome in the traditional sense, but there was something magnetic about him. His quiet strength, his deep knowledge of the land, and the way he seemed to carry himself with such confidence made Grace feel drawn to him in ways she couldn't fully explain. Yet, at the same time, she was hesitant. Her past relationships had been complicated and painful. She had learned the hard way that not every connection was meant to last. She was afraid of opening her heart again, especially to someone like Daryl, who seemed so closed off emotionally. One evening, after a particularly long hike, they sat together on a log near a small stream. The air was chilly, and Grace wrapped her arms around herself for warmth. "I never thought I'd find a place like this," she said softly, breaking the silence. "It's peaceful here. I feel like I can finally breathe." Daryl didn't answer right away. Instead, he gazed at the water flowing over the rocks, his expression unreadable. Grace waited, unsure of how to continue. But then, after a long pause, he spoke. "Not everyone's cut out for this kind of life," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "This place, it changes you. It makes you face things you might not want to." Grace didn't know what to say to that. She wanted to ask him more, to understand what he meant, but something held her back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the feeling that asking too many questions would push him away. She didn't know what she wanted, only that she wasn't ready to lose the connection they had. Little did Grace know, this moment was the beginning of something that would change both of their lives forever. The days after Grace's vulnerable conversation with Daryl were difficult. Despite the beauty of the mountains and the peace she had found in the quiet of the town, Grace couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her heart. She had confessed her growing feelings for Daryl, but his response had been cold and dismissive. He had pulled away, leaving her confused and hurt. His words echoed in her mind, and she wondered if perhaps he had been right. Maybe he wasn't someone she should get involved with. As the days passed, Grace tried to focus on the reason she had come to the mountains in the first place: to heal, to rediscover herself, and to escape the noise of her old life. Yet, every time she walked through the woods or looked out over the mountains, her thoughts returned to Daryl. She couldn't help but think about the way he had looked at her when they first met, the quiet moments they shared, and the way he seemed to understand her in ways no one else ever had. Despite everything, Grace couldn't let go of the connection she felt with him, but Daryl was not easy to read. After their conversation, he kept his distance, no longer joining her for walks or offering to show her the trails. He appeared to be busy with his own work, fixing fences and gathering wood for the winter. Whenever their paths crossed in town, he was polite but distant, avoiding eye contact and offering only brief, one-word responses to her attempts at conversation. Grace tried not to take it personally, but the silence between them weighed heavily on her. She had come to the mountains to find peace, but the distance between her and Daryl made her feel lonelier than ever. She spent more time in her cabin, wandering the trails by herself, but nothing seemed to ease the ache in her chest. One afternoon, feeling restless and desperate for some clarity, Grace decided to take a different route. She wandered down a trail that she hadn't explored yet, hoping that the fresh scenery would help clear her mind. As she walked, she tried to focus on the beauty around her, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of birds calling to each other, the rustling of the leaves underfoot. For a while, it worked. She began to relax, letting go of the tension that had built up inside her over the past few days. But then, as she rounded a bend in the trail, she saw him. Daryl was standing at the edge of a small clearing, his back to her as he worked on something. He was bending over, hammering a stake into the ground, his movements slow and deliberate. For a moment, Grace considered turning back and walking away. She didn't want to face him, not yet, not after everything that had happened. But something inside her urged her to go forward, to confront the tension that had been hanging between them. Taking a deep breath, Grace stepped forward, her footsteps light on the soft earth. "Daryl," she called softly. He froze at the sound of her voice. Slowly, he straightened up and turned around. His face was unreadable, but his eyes seemed to soften when they met hers. Grace noticed the faint lines around his eyes, the marks of someone who had spent years in the outdoors, living a life that was both physically demanding and emotionally isolated. "Grace," he said, his voice a little rougher than usual. "What are you doing out here?" "I was walking," she said, her heart racing. "I didn't expect to see you out here." Daryl nodded, glancing at the stake he had been working on before meeting her gaze again. "I was just fixing some things around here, getting ready for winter." Grace nodded, unsure of what to say next. She hadn't planned this conversation, and now that it was happening, she felt nervous, vulnerable. She hadn't realized how much she missed him until now, how much she craved his company despite the cold distance between them. "I didn't mean to upset you," she said finally, her voice softer than before. "When I told you how I felt, I didn't mean to pressure you. I don't know. I guess I thought we had something." Daryl's face hardened for a moment, and Grace held her breath, afraid that he might shut her out again. But after a long pause, he sighed, rubbing his hand over his face in frustration. "I'm not good at this," he said quietly. "I've never been good at letting people in. I've spent most of my life alone, in the mountains, away from everything and everyone. It's easier that way." Grace took a step closer, her heart aching for him. "I understand," she said, "but it doesn't mean you have to be alone forever. I'm not asking you to change your whole life. I just want to be part of it, in whatever way that means." Daryl looked at her, his expression conflicted. "You don't know what you're asking for, Grace," he said, his voice low. "This place, this life, it's not for everyone. It's hard, it's lonely, and I can't promise you anything. Not now, not after everything." Grace's throat tightened as she struggled to keep her emotions in check. "I don't need promises, Daryl. I don't need a perfect life. I just need you to be real with me. I've spent so long pretending everything was fine back in the city, pretending I could handle the heartbreak and the pressure. But this is different. You're different." For a moment, there was only silence between them, the sound of the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. Grace felt her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what Daryl was thinking, unsure of what he would say next. Finally, Daryl stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His face softened, and for the first time in days, Grace saw a glimpse of the man she had grown to care for. "I don't know what this is, Grace," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But I'm not going to run away from it. Not anymore." Grace's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what the future held, but in that moment, standing in the quiet of the woods, she realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something worth fighting for. Over the next few days, Grace and Daryl spent more time together. They didn't talk about their feelings or try to define what was happening between them. Instead, they simply enjoyed each other's company. Daryl showed Grace more of the mountains, and Grace shared stories about her life in the city. It was simple, unspoken, and yet it felt like everything had shifted. Grace knew that their journey wasn't going to be easy. There would be challenges ahead, and they both had their own emotional scars to heal. But for the first time since coming to the mountains, Grace felt a sense of hope. Whatever happened, she knew that she wasn't alone anymore. And in that moment, that was enough.